Okay, today we are going to talk about the circulatory system, and we're going to talk about the structures of the heart. We're going to talk about the pulmonary circuit and the systemic circuit. So basically how blood travels through the chambers of the heart and to the lungs where it becomes reoxygenated, and then also how blood travels through our body. There will be a lot of different parts of the body and arteries and veins that you will need to become familiar with. And a lot of this you will see in your lab. So the lecture is going to kind of be an overview of a lot of the content that you are going to cover in a lot of detail with your lab. So just know that this is kind of a starting point and something that you'll continue to go into more detail with. So we're going to start with the heart. The heart is a muscle. It pumps about 7,000 liters of blood through the body each day. And over an average lifetime, it contracts about 2.5 billion times. And the heart and all of the blood vessels make up the cardiovascular system. So that's what we're talking about today, the cardiovascular system. And we're going to talk about the two circuits, the pulmonary circuit, which is the circuit between the lungs and the heart, and the systemic circuit, which is everything else between the heart and all of the parts of the body that the oxygenated blood is going to and returning the deoxygenated blood. So this is showing both the systemic and the pulmonary systems. So what we'll talk about first is the pulmonary system. So here are our two lungs, here is the heart in the middle, and then up here, up and below, this is representing all of the possible places that the blood could go, all of the different systems. So we're going to focus here on the heart, the four chambers of the heart, and how the oxygen poor, deoxygenated blood goes to the lungs where it gets reoxygenated, the gas exchange between releasing the carbon dioxide and picking up the oxygen, and then bringing that oxygen-rich blood back to the heart. So let's start with the structure of the heart. So the structure of the heart is it's a hollow, cone-shaped muscular pump. There's four chambers, two atria for blood storage, and then two ventricles, one low pressure pump and one high pressure pump. So we are going to look through the structure of the heart. So the heart is in the center of the body. It lies in the thoracic cavity. The size varies with body size. I feel like the usual rule of thumb is that it's about the size of your fist. It's posterior to the sternum, medial to the lungs, anterior to the vertebral column. The base lies beneath the second rib, and the apex, which is this bottom part, is at approximately the fifth intercostal space, and it lies just above the diaphragm. So here it is in the center of the chest. Here's the base of the heart, the apex of the heart, the diaphragm. Here, we'll talk about this more when we talk about the pulmonary system. And here's the sternum. So the coverings of the heart, there's three places: the fibrous pericardium, the visceral pericardium, and the parietal pericardium. The fibrous pericardium, here, this is like a connective tissue, and then the visceral pericardium, this is the part it covers the visceral pericardium is what covers the heart. It is touching the organ. So usually when you see something that says visceral, that means it's in direct contact with the organ itself. And then there's the parietal, which is the cavity between the fibrous and the visceral. So the wall of the heart has three distinct layers: the epicardium, which is outer, myo, which is middle and the muscle, and then the endocardium, which is the inner layer. And you can see here kind of the relative sizes and structures here for the wall of the heart. So this, you can pause and take a look at this. Just shows the composition and function of the different structures of the wall of the heart. So the heart chambers and valves, so it's divided into 4 chambers, 2 upper atria and 2 lower ventricles. So we're going to talk about each 4. We're going to go through this a few different ways. Again, feel free to pause on any of the slides. You also will see this in much more detail as you're navigating through your lab questions. So the right atrium, it receives the blood from the inferior or superior vena cava or the coronary sinus. The right ventricle receives the blood from the right atrium. And then the left atrium receives the blood from the pulmonary vein. So now this is the oxygenated blood. And then the left ventricle receives blood from the left atrium. So this shows again kind of the flow of blood. You'll be looking at this again in a lot more detail on your own, but here it is if you want to pause and use this as a reference as you're navigating your lab. So here you see all of the different labeled parts of the heart. You can see the valves between the different chambers. We'll talk a lot about the chordae tendidae, which are these little kind of cords that are going to be pulling these valves open and closed as the blood moves from one chamber to another. Yeah, so the chordae tendidae, there's a better picture of it here. The chordae tendidae, these are the cords that are pulling the doors or the valves shut as the blood is flowing through. This is a different sectioning of the heart. It shows this fibrous ring and the connective tissue that provides the septum between the ventricles. And just kind of a different view showing that the mitral valve is a bicuspid and the tricuspid valve over here has 3 sections and the mitral valve has 2 sections. And we'll see again the pulmonary and aortic valves. So the path of blood through the heart, you can follow these arrows. And again, this is something that you'll do in a lot more detail as you're navigating the lab on your own. But you can see both the directions for the systemic and for the pulmonary circuits. So as the blood leaves here from the left atrium, and now we have oxygenated blood to go either to the tissue, wherever it's going, and then as it returns from either the lungs where it's been oxygenated to come back into the heart and then go back out to the other tissue, or the veins bringing the deoxygenated blood back to the heart to go to the lungs and then be circulated again. The path on this next slide would be helpful to help you navigate through all of these individual structures as you're first getting familiar with this. So you have blood from the systemic circuit. This would be like returning from a body part, and then it goes to the vena cava or the coronary sinus into the right atrium. And then between the right atrium and the right ventricle is the tricuspid valve. Then it would go from the right ventricle to the pulmonary trunk. So this would be deoxygenated, oxygen poor blood. It would go to the pulmonary trunk and the pulmonary arteries into the alveolar capillaries. This is where the gas exchange would happen. And this is where the carbon dioxide would be released and the oxygen would be picked up and carried by the hemoglobin. Then it would go to the left atrium, to the left ventricle through the mitral valve, and then from the left ventricle through the aortic valve to the aorta, and then out to the systemic circuit, to whatever part of the body the blood was going to. So the left and right coronary arteries supply blood to the tissues of the heart. So remember that arteries take oxygenated blood away from the heart and veins take deoxygenated blood back to the heart. And this is the case for all of the arteries and veins except for the pulmonary artery and vein. So the pulmonary artery takes the blood away from the heart, that's oxygen poor. And then the pulmonary vein is oxygen poor. And then the pulmonary artery, sorry, I'm saying this wrong. The pulmonary artery is oxygen poor, and the pulmonary vein, which is bringing the blood from the lungs back to the heart, that's oxygen rich. So all arteries would be oxygen rich except for the pulmonary artery, and all veins would be oxygen poor except for the pulmonary vein because they're going to and from the heart. This is another breakdown of where the blood is going from the aorta and then to the cardiac veins and cardiac sinus. Again, you'll see this in more detail in your own exploration of the lab. Here's another picture of all of the structures of the heart. Down here, this is the apex of the heart from two different views, showing the aorta and the superior vena cava at the top, and then the different structures, the coronary arteries, the ventricles, just showing all of this from both sides. Okay, so the heart chambers function in a coordinated fashion. So we said that the heart is a muscle, so it is contracting to pump blood throughout our body. And the ventricles and the atria it's a coordinated fashion. We don't want all four chambers contracting at the same time. We want it to be coordinating so we're pumping the blood from one place to another. So the heart actions are regulated so that the atria contract. When something is contracting, this is called systole, while the ventricles relax. And when something is relaxed, it's called diastole. So followed by the opposite, where we have ventricular systole and atrial diastole. So the atria fills up first at the top, and then the ventricles fill up second. So it's squeezing from the top to the bottom. So you can see that these valves coordinate this, where things are, it's preventing the blood from going between the chambers when it's not supposed to. And then here you can see where the blood is moving with the arrows. So during the cardiac cycle, the pressure in the heart rises and falls in atrial systole and ventricular diastole. So this causes an increase in ventricular pressure. So as these AV valves open and close and the ventricles relax, and then the opposite happens when in ventricular systole and atrial diastole. So the AV valves open in atrial systole and then they close in ventricular systole. And then these chordae tendidae, these are the chords that are opening and closing those valves, keeping them closed so blood flow is going in the appropriate direction. So you've all probably either listened to a heart with a stethoscope before or heard what these heart sounds sound like. This lub-dup sound. So the lub is the first heart sound. This is the ventricular systole. This is the AV valves closing. And then that dup is the second heart sound. That's the ventricular diastole. And a murmur is a sound when the cusps of the valves are not completely closing. So we'll see some examples of this in the lab. These are some of the common places where you can listen to those heart sounds. If you've been to the doctor's office and you see them move the stethoscope around when they're listening to your heart and breath sounds, they're listening to the different parts of your heart. So the cardiac muscle fibers form what's called a functional syncytium. So this means the mass of cells of this muscle are functioning as a unit. Even though there's complex different parts of the heart, it functions together in sync. So this is talking about the cardiac conduction system. So the SA node kind of starts this whole thing. We're going to see a picture of it. It's a specialized muscle. This is where the electrical charge comes from that starts the contractions of the different parts of the heart. So the SA node, and this is also sometimes called the pacemaker of the heart. So atrial syncytium, and then the junctional fibers, and then the AV node, the AV bundle, the bundle branches, the Purkinje fibers, and then ventricular syncytium. So we're going to see a picture of all of that here. This is showing the SA node is up here, the AV node is here, and then we have the Purkinje fibers here, more junctional fibers. Here's the AV bundle. So this is showing the electrical impulses that are being sent from this SA node, the direction that they're the electrical impulses, how they're being sent is causing the muscles to contract in a way that will cause parts of the heart to be contracted and relaxed in sync. This is what we're looking at when we look at an electrocardiogram. It's a recording of the electrical changes. And it's used to access the heart's ability to conduct impulses. So it shows the deflections of the P wave, the QRS complex, which is those 3 waves, and then the T wave. So this is atrial depolarization, ventricular depolarization, and then ventricular repolarization. So let's see what this looks like on an ECG. So on an ECG here, this is right here, the atrial systole, the A, as the atrium is depolarized. This is the P wave here, this first little part. You can see right here the P. That's what this is representing here. The next part is the QRS. This is the ventricular depolarization, QRS, the 3 waves, 1, 2, 3. And then the last part is the T, which is the ventricular repolarization. This is the ventricular diastole here. So this would be a typical ECG showing the electrical impulses of the heart as it's pumping. This here we're going to see more of when we look at the lab, but this is showing blood pressure, blood volume, and then the ECG, looking at all 3 of these together, and also the heart sounds, seeing when valves are closing and opening based on what's happening with the pressure in the heart and also with the electrical impulses as they're moving through the different parts in the heart. So this will be really good to put all together once we start looking at this. Okay, so let's look at how the heart is regulated. So the SA node, which we said was that muscle, that bundle of specialized muscles where the electric charge comes from, controls the heart rate. So that tells the heart when to contract. There's also sympathetic and parasympathetic fibers that control the heart rate as well. And there's also regulatory reflexes that control your heart rate. Also, we all know that when you're exercising, your heart beats faster because it is trying to transport oxygenated blood to your muscles as they're exercising and making ATP. Also, body temperature can impact your heart rate. Different ions can impact your heart rate. Again, the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nerve system, we're going to look at that in more detail here in a minute. But the parasympathetic, this is the rest and digest response, and this is from the vagus nerve. This will decrease your heart action, so it'll slow your heart rate. The sympathetic impulse, this is that fight or flight response. This will increase your heart rate. So we're going to see a little bit more about how that works. So here, there would be some sort of stimuli, some sort of response. And here we see the fibers of the parasympathetic vagus nerve, which is going to the SA node of the heart. So again, the parasympathetic response of the vagus nerve, this would tell your heart rate to slow down. And then here, these are the fibers of the sympathetic nerve. This would be like that flight or fight response. This would tell your heart rate to speed up. So this is showing how these nerves can also help coordinate the heart rate that's regulated by that SA node. Okay, let's look at some blood vessels. So blood vessels are also organs of the cardiovascular system. So the cardiovascular system includes the heart and all of the blood vessels. The blood vessels make a closed circuit to and from the heart. And we have arteries and veins, but more specifically, we have arteries, and then smaller arteries are called arterioles. And then capillaries are where we have the exchange between the arterioles and the venules. The venules are kind of smaller veins, and then we have veins. So these are the structures that make up the blood vessels. So let's take a look at what they look like. So here we have a picture of an artery and a vein, and arteries and veins are made up of the same structures with one exception. Arteries, you can think of artery away. It takes oxygenated blood away from the heart. And vein, this is the deoxygenated, oxygen poor blood returning to the heart. And all of the structures are the same, even though they are might be different sizes, except for veins have these valves that prevent blood from going in the wrong direction. Arteries do not have these valves. So you can see the lumen. This is the open space. This is where the blood would flow through. You can see the lumen space. The diameter is smaller in an artery than it is in a vein. You can see the endothelium. Next, the connective tissue, the tunica media, and then the tunica externa on the outside. So the artery going away from the heart is nearest to the heart, so it has a thicker, stronger wall, endothelial lining, and it carries the blood under relatively high pressure. So it has a smaller lumen. It also has a thicker, stronger wall. So the closer you are to the heart, which is the pump, the more force the blood is going to have going through that artery. So that's why your blood pressure is higher in an artery than it is in a vein. And typically when you get your blood pressure taken, you get a blood pressure curve here in your brachial artery, and this is pretty close to your heart. So this is a great place to take your blood pressure, at an artery that's near your heart, near the pump. The arterioles are a continuation of the arteries. Kind of if you think of the arteries as like a main highway, like the interstate, the arterioles are like a smaller road that branches off, and it helps control blood flow. Sometimes there can be detours around these different arterioles, and they can undergo vasoconstriction and vasodilation, meaning they can expand and contract. Kind of a good example of this is that depending on what's going on with the rest of your body system, blood might be more in one area than another. So If you've just eaten a big meal, probably a lot of your blood is going to your digestive system. So maybe some of the arterioles to some of your bigger muscles in your arms and legs are constricted and less blood flow is going to those muscles. If you are exercising, probably more of your blood flow is going to go to your muscles and less blood is going to go to your digestive system. This is one of the reasons why they tell you not to eat a big meal before you're doing exercise, like swimming or running. Obviously, it wouldn't feel good to be doing vigorous exercise while having a big full stomach, but also another reason is that when you're exercising, your digestive system is getting less blood flow. So you're not able to digest your food as well if your blood flow is being taken away from your digestive system and going to these bigger muscles. And this is a picture of kind of the arteriole. So this would have branched off from an artery. So this would be smaller than the artery. And then from this, it would branch off into the capillary. Here we are seeing for the first time this precapillary sphincter. So these muscles here can contract and relax to regulate the amount of blood flow depending on what the needs of the system are at that time. So from the artery to the arteriole to the capillaries are the smallest in diameter, and they connect the smallest arteriole to the smallest venule. So this is where we go from oxygen-rich blood to oxygen-poor blood. This is where that gas exchange is happening. This is where oxygen is being delivered to whatever tissue needs it. And these are semi-permeable, these capillaries. So if you look here, we'll see that this is just one cell thick, this capillary. And you can see even here with in this microgram picture that you can see that there's kind of little spaces in there where things can kind of leak through. And we saw this when we talked about white blood cells and how white blood cells can kind of sneak through these endothelial cells in these spaces. So this is what happens in the capillaries where we have fluid and we're having gas exchange between the oxygenated blood that's carrying the oxygen, and then we have the oxygen being removed going to the tissues, and now we would have the deoxygenated venous blood that's going to return to the heart. Okay, so here's a picture. Red indicates oxygen rich and blue indicates oxygen poor, and then the way that they interact between them. This is the capillaries where we're exchanging the oxygen. Oxygen is what's called the primary electron, the terminal electron acceptor in the electron transport chain, which is the third and final part of cellular respiration. That's how we make ATP. So this is back from biology. This is why the whole point of all of this is to get oxygen to the cells for aerobic respiration. Remember, we need oxygen to go through cellular respiration. We don't need oxygen for glycolysis, that first step, but we do need oxygen for the TCA cycle and the electron transport chain. So that's why we're doing all of this, is to get the oxygen to the cells, because we need oxygen in that inner mitochondrial matrix where these metabolic pathways are happening. So it helps if you can think about why the cells are trying to do what they're doing. So don't lose sight of that. We need to transport the oxygen. We transport it in a hemoglobin, which is a part of the red blood cell. And again, we need this transport molecule because the blood is mostly made up of water. Water is polar, oxygen is nonpolar. So we need a way to get the oxygen to where it needs to be. Okay, so this is showing the changes in pressure, millimeters of mercury, this mmHg. This is a measure of pressure, so don't worry so much about the mmHg. It's basically just showing you the change in pressure. So you can see when we have blood from the arteriole through the capillary where the pressure is changing and then blood is flowing to the venule, you see that the blood pressure is higher from on the side closer to the heart, and then it's lower on the side that's away from the heart. So the net force at the anteriolar end is higher than the net force at the venular end. So we're going to talk more about this soon when we talk about the lymphatic system and see how the lymphatic system also impacts blood pressure here. Big picture, you should understand that the blood pressure is higher closer to the heart and lower away from the heart. Okay, so we talked about the arteries and the capillaries. Let's talk about the veins and the venules. So the venules are the smaller of the veins. They go between the capillaries and they merge into the veins. These have thinner walls than the arterioles, and again, they need a thinner wall. Well, they just don't require a thicker wall because the blood pressure is lower because we're farther away from the heart. There's less smooth muscle and elastic tissue than the arteriole, again, because the blood pressure is lower. Veins, these have thinner walls than arteries, again, because the blood pressure is lower. They have flap-like valves. So this is the primary difference, well, aside from the strength of the walls. The structure that veins have that arteries do not is these flap-like valves. And because the pressure in the veins is considerably lower than it is in the arteries, you could have blood kind of back up between heart contractions. So these valves prevent the blood from going backwards. So this is showing towards the heart, and then after the contraction of the heart, these valves close to prevent the blood from going back where it came from. And then this graph here is interesting. It shows where is all the blood. What is the percent distribution of blood in your body? So remember we said there's about 5 liters of blood in your body all the time. Most of the blood in your body, 60 to 70% of that 5 liters, is somewhere in your veins. Some of it, 10 to 12%, is in your heart in your lungs, getting oxygenated. Some of it is in your heart getting pumped. And then some of it is in your systemic arteries, so in the arteries in your limbs and in all the other parts of your body. And then the smallest percent is in the capillaries. But most of your blood, when it's being pumped, is just kind of waiting in this reservoir of your veins, getting pumped back to your heart so it can go to your lungs and get oxygenated again. So we just covered a lot, and everything that I said can be summarized here. So feel free to pause here and review this. Okay, so let's talk about blood pressure. So we've talked about blood pressure a little bit. I said typically the location of blood pressure when you go to a doctor's office is in your brachial artery. So that is close to your heart. So you're going to get a nice strong blood pressure there. And what blood pressure is defined as is the pressure, the force that the blood exerts against the inner walls of the blood vessels. And again, this is most commonly measured in arteries. So arterial blood pressure rises when the ventricles contract, and then it falls when the ventricles relax. So contracting and relaxing. Systolic pressure is the maximum pressure when ventricular contraction, and diastolic pressure is the minimum pressure when the ventricle relaxes. So when you get a blood pressure and you get 2 numbers, it's the systolic, so the contracted pressure, over the diastolic, the relaxed pressure. These are the typical parts for blood pressure being measured. Again, the brachial artery here, where this blood pressure cuff goes, this is typically where you would see a blood pressure be measured. Okay, so let's look at some factors that influence arterial blood pressure. So there's lots of different heart rate increases, blood volume increases, stroke volume increases, blood viscosity increases that could be caused from dehydration. Viscosity is it's a property of liquids that talks about how readily a liquid can move. It's defined as resistance to flow. So the thicker the liquid, the higher its viscosity. And during dehydration, sometimes your blood is more viscous than when you are properly hydrated. Another one would be peripheral resistance increases. This would be due to a blockage somewhere. If blood was having a hard time getting through an artery, that could increase blood pressure. Again, all of this regulation is happening in order to maintain homeostasis. So we'll talk about homeostasis probably in all of the different contexts, all of the different organ systems. Living things are always trying to maintain homeostasis, and blood pressure is one of them, trying to regulate blood pressure to be at the perfect homeostasis value. So this says blood pressure is determined by cardiac output and peripheral resistance. So blood pressure equals the cardiac output times the peripheral resistance. And it is being regulated by one of these two factors. So either you're increasing your blood pressure or decreasing your blood pressure to have this blood pressure maintained. And this blood pressure maintained here, this is what I'm talking about with homeostasis. So here is again another pathway, some things that we've talked about so far. Feel free to pause here and look at this. This is what we've been going through, summarized in this chart. Okay, let's talk about venous blood flow. So blood pressure decreases as the blood moves. And this is only partly due to the heart. So the heart is the pump, which is pumping our blood, but also venous blood flow is due to our skeletal muscle contraction. So as our skeletal muscle is contracting, it's also squeezing around those veins and helping push the blood back to the heart. So the heart is pumping blood away from the heart. When that's happening, it's also pushing the venous blood back to the heart, but skeletal muscle, breathing motions, and venoconstriction with those muscles, those sphincters around the veins, also help return the blood back to the heart. Okay, so all veins, remember veins are bringing deoxygenated blood back to the heart. All veins except those returning from the heart to the lungs drain into the right atrium. So this is where the blood returns to the heart after it's been out on its journey to whatever system it was being delivered to. So therefore the pressure, this is the pressure of the right atrium. So a weakly beating heart increases central venous pressure because it's being backed up. So this can lead to a lot of blood backing up into these peripheral veins. And we already said that so much of the blood, how much of the blood? Like 50 to 60%, 60 to 70% of the blood is already in our veins. So if our heart isn't pumping our blood strongly and more blood is kind of pooling up in those peripheral veins, this can lead to peripheral edema. This is when you sometimes see swelling in your limbs. And again, this will be something that we'll cover in more detail when we talk about the lymphatic system and see how that is involved. Okay, So we said at the very beginning, the cardiovascular system is the heart and all of the blood vessels, and we said there's two major circuits. There's the pulmonary circuit and the systemic circuit. So the pulmonary circuit is going between the heart and the lungs, and then the systemic circuit is going to all of the systems. Also, it's how the blood gets its own oxygen. So the pulmonary circuit, again, is going between, we're looking at the heart and the lungs. So we're going from the heart to the lungs, where we are exchanging carbon dioxide right here for oxygen right here. And now the oxygenated blood is returning to the heart. So this next slide kind of shows in a little bit of detail how this oxygen and carbon dioxide is being exchanged. Again, this is the capillary. Remember, this is a single layer of epithelial cells. We saw this a few slides ago when we looked at a capillary. This is showing here, this is representing how this blue would represent oxygen, poor blood, and then here, this is where we're picking up the oxygen from the hemoglobin. The hemoglobin is picking up the oxygen. This is alveolar air. So this is like the air in your lungs. And this is happening here because of this very thin single layer of epithelium cells. This is where the oxygen exchange happens. Again, this is where we're going to see the lymphatic capillaries and lymph flow also here, and this will be talked about in more detail when we talk about the lymphatic system. Okay, so let's talk about the systemic circuit. So this is going to all the other parts of our body, and this is composed of vessels that lead from the heart to all the body parts except to the lungs. Remember, the lungs are the pulmonary circuit. So everything except the lungs is called the systemic circuit. And it includes the aorta and its branches. So we're going to talk a lot about the different parts of the aorta and how the aorta supplies blood to all of the systems of the body. And we also will talk about the system of veins that return the blood to the right atrium. So it leaves the left atrium, returns to the right atrium. Again, I am not going to spend a ton of time going through each of this because each of these, the names of each of these parts, because you are going to do this again in lab and spend time identifying them on your own. So this is just a good place to reference everything here in one place, and then you will see all of this in lab. So here's the arterial system. Also, we're going to look at the venous system. Most of the time, the name of the vein is the same as the name of the artery. There are a few exceptions, but see how it says superficial temporal A artery? We also will see a superficial temporal V for vein. So we're going to just quickly go through all of these. And again, you can pause at any time to use this as a reference. So these are the principal branches of the aorta. Again, this is the major artery leaving the heart. There's the ascending aorta, the arch of the aorta, the descending aorta, and the thoracic aorta. So throughout these, this is the oxygenated blood leaving the heart, going to all of the systems. Also the abdominal aorta. I'm not sure if I said that, but we're going to see each of these. We're going to see where everything goes. Okay, again, these are the arteries and veins leaving the heart. I'm not going to go through each of these because you're going to do this in lab, but this is the structure of the heart and how the blood leaves and returns. So this is a picture here of the abdominal aorta, seeing some of the organs that are around it, and then the arteries that are branching off of the abdominal aorta. Next, these are the arteries to the brain, head, and neck. Again, many of these are going to have a corresponding vein. This superficial temporal aorta artery here, this is that artery that's kind of in your temple right here that sometimes if you've been on a long run or you're exercising really hard, you can see this pulsing. This is your superficial temporal artery. This supplies your brain. This is a different picture of the brain and how the arteries are supplying oxygenated blood to the brain. Here, the brain kind of has this network of arteries that would serve to kind of help get oxygenated blood to the brain if there was a blockage somewhere. This structure here, it looks like kind of like a roundabout here with all of these different exits. This is called the Circle of Willis, this structure of arteries here in the brain. Next, we look at the arteries to the shoulder and the upper limb. So here's the arm. Here's the brachial artery. We said this artery here, this is a strong artery with a high blood pressure. It's coming right off of the aorta. This is where we normally take blood pressure. Here, this radial artery, this is a common place to take your pulse. Here are all the structures there. This is showing the arteries to the thoracic and abdominal walls. So we have the thoracic aorta, and then here you can see the vertebrae, and it goes in here. We have posterior, interior, external, internal. Really, once you know the prefixes and suffixes that tell you the direction and the orientation to these different structures, it's all just how everything is oriented. So it seems like a lot, but once you understand how the names are telling you the positioning, it's much less than it appears. So these are the arteries to the pelvis. Again, feel free to pause. And the arteries to the lower limbs, showing the anterior and the posterior view. So this is toes forward, this is toes away. Showing arteries in the legs. And then here's the venous system. So again, once you understand the arteries, most of the arteries have a corresponding vein. There are some that are different. This great saphenous vein, for example, this is unique. There's not a corresponding artery to this, but here's the superficial temporal vein here, which in the arteries we saw the superficial temporal artery. So most of these have a corresponding artery and vein, but there are a few exceptions. Okay, so let's look at some of the differences between venous pathways and arterial pathways. So the vessels in the venous system originate from the capillaries into venules and then into small veins and then into larger veins. Unlike the arterial pathways, which are very defined, the venous systems are a little more difficult to follow, and they can have some irregular networks and unnamed tributaries. So tributaries, this is a term that you probably learned in geography, where rivers and bays and different bodies of water come and mix together. So same idea here. So this is showing the veins in the brain, head, and neck. Again, similar, but not as detailed as the arteries. We have a jugular here. Again, upper limb and shoulder. And again, this would be weak. This would not be strong like the arteries are. This is returning to the heart. So this would have a much lower blood pressure than the arteries. And then here's the veins from the abdominal and thoracic walls, superior vena cava. And then from the abdomen, again, lots of similarities between the veins and the arteries, same names. This is showing a very simplified version of all of the major places of gas exchange. So these are the major organ systems. So in the head and the brain, the limbs, here in the lungs, it goes from the aorta to these different aortas. So going to all of these organs here in the trunk, and then going through gas exchange, so using that oxygen in whatever system it's being delivered to, then it's returning the oxygen poor deoxygenated back to the inferior vena cava if it's coming from down here, or the superior vena cava if it's coming from up here, and then from there goes to the lungs, gets oxygenated again, and out it goes around and around. So again, this is helpful for when you start identifying all of this and working through the pathways on your own. Lower limbs, again, an anterior and a posterior view. And then the last thing for the cardiovascular system is just talking about how lifespan changes some of the ways that the cardiovascular system acts. So over time, cholesterol deposits can impact blood vessels. We need some cholesterol in our blood vessels. Cholesterol in membranes contributes to plasticity. So you want the correct amount of cholesterol so your membranes are the right amount of fluid. They're not too fluid and they're not too rigid. Also, there are different things that can cause heart enlargement, which can impact your heart's ability to pump blood. Cardiac muscle cells decline, increase of fibrous tissue, increase of adipose tissue around the heart can weaken the muscle. High blood pressure, increase in blood pressure can make your heart work harder to pump the same amount of blood. Decrease in resting heart rate. So again, that is very taxing on your heart as a muscle. The lumens of the arteries can narrow. We talked about atherosclerosis, and then decrease in arterial elasticity. So many of these things impact the lifespan of our cardiovascular system, not just our heart, but also the blood vessels that the blood is being pumped through. So this was a lot. Again, I didn't go into a ton of detail in all of the specific anatomical structures because you are going to be doing that a lot on your own, but this is a good reference to refer back to as you are labeling things. Yeah, let me know if you have any questions.